Hello everyone, welcome. Please, my esteemed guests, make your way onto the stage. We have with us today MEPs, both from the ITRE committee, Ms. Eva Maydell, Bulgarian MEP from the EPP, and also rapporteur on the CHIPS Act, and her colleague Bart Groothuis, Dutch member of Renew, and also on the ITRE committee. And my name, as my colleague Clotilde said, is Antoaneta Roussi, and I'm the cybersecurity reporter at POLITICO Europe. So, welcome, thank you for joining us. Let's get started then. Bart.
Yes.
A recent interviewee of mine from a US cybersecurity firm told me that the EU had a mania in becoming a regulatory superpower.
Yeah.
And the continent actually suffers from a dire lack of innovative technologies. What's your view on that as a regulator?
I guess we have to start with the final interview that President Obama gave when he left office in 60 minutes. And he said, what's the worst thing that you did? And he said, the worst thing I didn't see was, I thought that very large online platforms like Twitter and Facebook, what you have, were a force of good, spreading of knowledge, interfering people with democracy and getting stuff done. And he said, I had a blind spot for the weaknesses of that model. And I see that there's more hatred than ever, that it causes disruptions in our democratic model. And we have to regulate that. And like we know, his successor, Donald Trump, wasn't very eager to regulate it, was he? And Biden doesn't have a majority in both houses. So many of the lawmakers I speak to in Capitol Hill, now you do too, Eva, is they asked us, they said, please Europe, you do it, you put a string on Silicon Valley. And I'm glad that we did. I'm really glad that we did. I'm proud that we did.
That's quite cheeky, no, for the lawmakers in the DC to be saying we should be regulating their Silicon Valley.
Yes, and that's it, because it won't come from Asia, Africa, or Latin America. It will come from Europe, because those companies will look at Europe and the business model. It's the most powerful, most economy that we have in the world, and I guess that we can use that and leverage that, and we did. And we have some industrial policies to make sure that we become stronger. But to be honest, Antoaneta, I think that what the Commission has just mentioned, and what we're looking at the past years, we've had such a regulatory amount of legislation on our companies and on platforms, but also on regular companies, that we see a problem in competitiveness, that we see a problem in how we compete. And I guess that it's not just about network fees. I dislike that discussion a lot. I want to see more lower taxes. I want to see better competitive environments across the globe. And I think that what President von der Leyen said in Strasbourg in her State of the Union was very good. It's the second phase. We have this digital and green transition. The first phase, we've had that, fine. Now is the new phase, a second phase, which we'll see for competitiveness. That's what I want to see for the new Commission to put on the table.
And Eva, maybe just going on of that, the digital decade, it covers a very wide scope, right? And Parliament this year alone has been inundated with tech legislation. You are the head of one. How successful is all of this legislation actually working together?
I mean, it's a great question. It's actually the type of question I think we should be asking ourselves before we start working on all those files. And some would argue that we do. However, what I would personally like to see is us thinking ahead of time in a more strategic manner. How does all these files, I like to call them, it's kind of a bulk of a regulatory jigsaw in a way. How does it all make sense together? So on one hand is the regulation itself, and on the other hand is the output that it creates out there, and most importantly, sometimes the burdensome part of it that affects companies. And so one is regulatory jigsaw, the other is a digital jigsaw. So if they both make some sort of a good sense together, and if they fit seamlessly as a jigsaw, then probably we could have a digital decade souffle to rise once we reach our goal in terms of a year. But where we were good at it, I worked on a couple of files very closely, and I think some of those, particularly the CHIPS Act, I would like to think about it as a file that was not just ordering something and making something, the market better organized or putting away gatekeepers such as other legislations do, or it was more of a strategic view that the CHIPS Act, for example, had. And I think if we have more of those type of files, also the NIS too that we worked on, it's in a way preparing our resilience, ordering things, but also looking ahead of time. I think if we would have a little bit more of those sort of files, we might be better prepared for that competitiveness part that Bart talked about, because I have always been very open in a critical manner over the past 4 years and saying that we have the goals and the aims, we know what we want to achieve, but we kind of miss the real means that could also make us competitive. We have to put the two at a balance, and ideally it comes more or less at the same time and not with a couple of years of delay. But I'm very glad that we're talking competitiveness again.
And we're obviously going towards an election year very soon. Are we going to make all of these pieces of legislation succeed? And if not, which one could be sacrificed?
Well, listen, the problem in the European Commission in general is that it's too large, we know, and if we will enlarge Europe, we have to make sure that we do reforms both in the Council, but also in the Commission. And I would say cutting down the number of Commission would be good in 14, but now comes the answer to your question is, the problem with the main legislation that we made is not that we make them or we write them, it's the problem of implementation and maintaining them and making sure it's implemented well. And I guess the half of the Commission could write proposals and the other half should be making sure it's implemented and it's working. And that's the division of effort I'd like to see in the future European Commission.
What I often see is that towards the end of the term, we tend to speed things up. My worry is that we shouldn't push things too much and sacrifice the quality of the output that we put out there. We have thousands of hours put working. If you look at the numbers of all the legislation, it's impressive, particularly in the tech domain. Obviously, there hasn't been a busier time for legislators here in the Brussels bubble. But my call to all those counting just the number of legislative proposals proposed and the ones adopted is to actually not look at the mere number, but to look at what have those proposals achieved, or what do they plan to achieve, and then think very strategically for the next batch of legislation that's going to be out there. But I would absolutely subscribe and agree with Bart here. I have called numerous times for us to take proper stock. What's implemented, what maybe is not necessary any longer, what should be scratched entirely.
In terms of legislation.
In terms of legislation. And I think we need to have, a particular team devoted to that, because only like this we can also stay competitive. In terms of competitiveness, there's a number of other points that I will bring later on into the discussion, but that's one way to one part of being competitive and better prepared.
Is that Bart kind of stated his wish for if he could ask the Commission to do one thing, what would it be? Is that yours, Eva, or is there something else?
Well, my one thing is on the strategy part. I think we need to answer the bigger questions. So very often, I think legislation is meant to, first of all, fix something of the past. That is not a bad thing necessarily. We do need to fix something that went wrong or we think is not going well. But more importantly, where I see Europe today is having enough of those files that are ordering our market, that are making more rules, that are putting guardrails. And where I see a little bit of a lack is thinking how to be truly resilient, how to be better prepared, how to make sure investments flow into Europe and not the other way around, how to make sure that talent wants to come to Europe, how to give those incentives. Bart mentioned some of them. I also often mention whether it's tax incentives, how do we make companies remain in Europe and make sure that they also decide to invest in Europe. So I would like to see more of this sort of brainstorm and this sort of execution for the years to come.
One of the aims of the Digital Decade strategy was for 75% of EU companies to be using cloud, AI, big data, but a study at the end of 2021 found only 41% of European businesses were using cloud, and that's mostly for emails. The number for AI is just 8%. The US, meanwhile, is 94% as of 2023, so let's say 2-year differentiation, and 35% for AI. That's really a stark difference. How are we realistically going to encourage those companies to use these technologies, Bart?
Well, not by creating a new EU cloud certification scheme outing all American companies, because really, I'm not if you're an SME somewhere in Europe, doesn't matter where you are, you want to do something with AI or with you can't do that without AWS or Azure or Google, IBM. You need those companies. They're fast, they have the software, the platform, it's cheap, it's what they have. There aren't any European alternatives. Now the Commission says we want to create that by industrial policy, using cybersecurity schemes to out those American companies and put in European companies. I think it's wrong. We should do a better job ourselves. So that's not the way you do that. And listen, for cloud, we can do a lot in Europe, and we can create new companies to build. But currently, there are 4 companies in Europe who can compete with the cloud certification scheme that ENISA has put forward, and they're all 4 companies that are all French.
Which are?
That's not the way to go forward either. So I would say we need better policies than this. This is not we don't need protectionist agendas. That's what I would say.
What would be some of the policies that you would suggest? I mean, it is a very difficult discussion, right? But if it's not industrial policy by limiting competitors in order to sort of raise yours up, what would you suggest?
Well, a real small amount of about 100 million euros. It might sound really a lot, but it's not in terms of the entire EU budget. But if you would say Google's most advertised services in Europe, you could also create a Google, GEU, you can create your own email service, a web browser that is currently more less intrusive. You can offer platforms really cheap. If you want to do that, put forward some industrial policy on that. And why is the business model still aimed at gathering the majority of the data instead of offering the best service? One more example, DSA and DMA, very important. What we regulated is this. If you're a customer and you click on something, and the relationship with that platform, that's regulated. But every time you click and you read something online, you do something, about 300 CEOs on the Cayman Islands become very happy because your data is being aggregated, collected, it's traded, and your data profile is enriched, and they offer better services to you. Services meaning advertisements. I don't want that. So what we should do in the next EU Commission phase, the new European Commission, is to regulate not just customer platform, but that entire world of all those 300 CEOs at the Cayman Islands and make them less happy. Regulate that sphere of trading that data that would actually enable micro-targeting. That enables, if you get that, you get the angle out of the business model, and Europe would have more air to breathe. There are plenty of techniques. Tim Berners-Lee wrote about it, a great paper. There's blockchain technology. There's about 10 technologies we've identified. They are there already. But the question is, do we want to regulate the sphere of the 300 CEOs on the Cayman Islands? And making sure if we get that right, we have a new industry in Europe. We have different business here. That's what I think.
Can I quickly come on the data points that you quoted and go a bit in a different perspective? I think comparing ourselves to other competitors is important because if others can, achieve this double or triple times the percentage with which we transform our industry, I guess we can do it as well. And two things. First of all, we can also look at the pace with which Europe's economy has been growing over the past 15 years. If we compare the data for the past 15 years between Eurozone countries and the US, we'll see that the US economy has almost doubled, and Eurozone economy has barely grown over this past couple of years, despite new member states actually joining the Eurozone. If you look at which are the largest companies and in which domain, the answer we all know. So I'm wondering here, isn't it worth us reconsidering the way we look at our economy? It has created enormous benefits for our societies, the way social market economy has worked in Europe, and it has to continue to do so. But it will become ever more difficult for governments to support our citizens should we not grow at some sort of a sustainable pace. And in my view, investing in innovation, but in areas where, maybe we were strong in the past, maybe we have current strengths, we don't necessarily need to copy a model that's successful elsewhere, because it might be very difficult and I believe, almost impossible to do that. So this is where we need to put the focus. And in a way, I am also, just as also Bart mentioned, I'm also very glad that the Commission President seems to have realized that. And in her State of the Union, she seems to be giving that push towards paving the way towards this sort of different innovation, so to say, or, investing where Europe's strengths are. Because very often people say, okay, so how will the AI Act help innovation? Well, its origins are actually the way it was proposed. It was not necessarily to help innovation. Did we put provisions to have, for example, regulatory sandboxes? Yes, we did. So we introduced measures where companies can benefit to test their products, to have some sort of a framework where they don't need to go into the market immediately, but to have the innovation cycle work. But we need another vehicle as well. This will not, it's not at the same footing as all the guardrails we're putting on the table.
Mm. In her 2021 State of the Union, the Commission President declared the need for an EU Chips Act, but she also said that instead of millions of people looking for a job, millions of jobs are looking for people. So the big key word here is skills, and if we're going to become competitive in chips and getting those factories up and running, we're going to need many people working at them. So what can be done? What's some practical things that we can, we're always hearing skills. What actually needs to be done?
So on skills, I'm glad you asked that question, even though for me personally, it becomes more and more difficult to answer that question each year that passes. Why? Because I was probably one of the first people to talk education about 10 years ago here in the city. And I remember I've argued with numerous colleagues telling me, look, that's a national competence. Don't even think about it, putting it on the table. No one wants to, hear what you want to say, and we should not be discussing it. Of course, the Commission has been good in trying to nudge here and there member states by, again, providing data points, different initiatives. But I think we would all agree in this room that all our efforts haven't been necessarily enough. We've reached a good level overall in Europe, but we have not been able to attract the most, talented talent out there in the world. I like to call it, it's a global war for talent where we live nowadays. And this is why we need to change our mindset. We need to change the way we view talent in Europe and how to attract it. And maybe it's time, because Bart spoke about EU reform. Everyone currently has one item on the agenda that's related to EU reform. Maybe we need to be a little bit more bolder and find ways one day to perhaps see whether, we won't have some sort of a more European strategy on education. I believe in innovative education, different than the one we have today, but currently what we more need is to attract the talent. But as you know, especially the representatives of private sector, I think talent goes where there's other talent and where they can test their ideas. So we are going back to that ecosystem that some of you mentioned earlier. I'm overly critical overall, but I really think we need to see this with a different lenses compared to the way we've been seeing it over the past years. It's not just about digital skills or critical thinking. It's a much broader strategy.
Is there any particular universities or institutions that you admire in their approach to education in Europe?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are many for sure. I just think that it's not, we need scale. That's what we lack. So we need to look at some of the good examples that are there and ideally multiply them. But as I said, often talent is not necessarily in Europe. So how do we compete with Japan? How do we compete with the US, with the UK particularly? This is my worry. You have centers of excellence. IMAC, very nearby, attracts one of the best talents in the whole world. But it's, ideally we can find other talent in other domains. ASML attracts some of the other best talent around the world.
If you look at ASML, for example, it's not just the talent that they're looking for. They're also looking for talented politicians. Peter Wenning, the CEO, came to visit me in Brussels last week. We had a lunch. You were invited, but unfortunately you couldn't make it. Yeah. But it was really good. But what he said, he was on vacation in Korea, and the Korean, the Korean Prime Minister or President got note of it. So he went to see Peter, and he said he talked about immersion, about deep UV, EUV, about atomic layering deposition, who owns the companies, how that is interconnected in the world. What politician here can speak on that level of detail on how the most complex supply chain that we have, the chips, how, semicon, how that relates and what you want to achieve, and from cradle to grave with building blocks, building a new, not just one ecosystem, but several, that you say, okay, this is cars we want, then we want to have these and these building blocks across Europe. You want Silicon Valleys. This is not agricultural policy or cohesion funds, where we spread it across all European countries, nice and neat. No, it's about Silicon Valleys and ecosystems, like you said. And Eindhoven is a good example of a university I visit very often.
Just a brief thing on that, because I think it's an extremely important point. When the CHIPS Act first was presented, I got numerous calls, I'm sure you do. Oh, I would like to have a factory. That's how people called me up. And I was like, hey, would you want to have a fab? Yeah. in my region, in my city. I'm like, so first of all, it's none of the responsibility of us. And second of all, I said, well, that's not how it's going to work. So what we did together with Dan Nika, we visited so many different parts of the ecosystem to get ourselves properly informed. And to a certain extent, we revamped very much the CHIPS Act, the way it was initially proposed, because we actually listened to the ecosystem. And this is why I really think it made the difference. And a fun point, we haven't visited one place which apparently is instrumental that I've learned 10 days ago. There's a special, the most important part that ASML machines use is a special laser that's produced in Germany by a local company. And apparently without this, even the ASML machines can't work. So speaking of strategic autonomy, there you go. It's the only company in the world, apparently.
So So the politicians are the problem.
Always, always.
Great conclusion for this 5-minute talk on chips.
Let's, we've got some questions from our online audience. One from Maciek, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Do you think that digital decade goals will be achieved by 2030 by all member states? Which states are today most behind on this journey? Bart?
Well, it's very hard. We had some Lisbon goals that we would be the most innovative player in the world in 2020, and Eva just mentioned a couple of facts and figures. We didn't really succeed in that. Now we have digital decade goals. It's questionable. What is good is that there's the intention, there's the direction. Just to touch on the CHIPS Act, there was a 43 billion investment scheme envisaged public-private across Europe. Commissioner Breton, which I spoke to in Strasbourg, and you probably did too, said there was already more than 100 billion on financial investment decisions on the table in boardrooms across Europe. So it's getting better and better. What I dislike in Europe is that 74% of all state aid is done by Germany and France. This is not the level playing field we have. Just one example. I currently negotiate the hydrogen bank. And it's about getting an auction out there in late autumn, about 800 million, and getting sure that green renewable hydrogen will become compatible with fossil-based grey hydrogen, right? That's a model we can work with in the digital sphere as well, because auctions ensure a level playing field across nations. Auctions enable that the best innovative technologies come across. That's why we need to have the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, very interesting. Use auctions instead of ordinary state aid. That's a way that we can become more competitive with a level playing field in Europe. I think a new way for the new Commission to come forward.
Eva, there's another question from our online audience, which is, how is the EU actually monitoring the implementation of the digital decade target, especially in the member states who joined since 2004? Are you aware of?
Well, it's probably a better question fit for the Commission, to be honest. But you know, I've always said that because the event is also titled Digital Transformation. So I think we also need to ask ourselves, when it comes to member states, how many European member states put that digital transformation already of their government, not to mention of their industry and their economy, as one of their top 5 priorities. Maybe there is at least half member states, I'm not aware, but I think we need to push them to get that number higher, and the priority also higher on their list, because it would enable any other part of what they possibly want to do, whether it's they want to excel in their green goals, whatever they want to do, they want to provide better services for their citizens, it only makes sense. And if anything, we are delayed with that. I think here there's a great deal to learn from Ukraine, who in the past 2 years have done a tremendous job in their digital transformation. And looking at what they have done, I think could serve as an inspiration for EU member states.
Yeah. I mean, the world has, speaking of Ukraine, the world has really changed since the digital decade strategy was launched, right? We had a pandemic, we've got an ongoing war, et cetera, recession, perhaps. You know, do you think the aims of the strategy are still relevant, especially in areas like global supply chain, critical infrastructure? Do we need to revisit some areas?
We need to revisit it. And the question is, listen, we could be open and trading with all countries in the world. But there are a couple of countries, I guess 4 or 5 of them, who have an offensive espionage program directed against us. And it's very aggressive, and they oblige their companies and citizens to compel with any request to fulfill those offensive espionage aims. I think those countries, we are talking about China, Russia, Iran, and probably North Korea, those countries, we have to treat them differently when it comes to visa and migration, but also to critical infrastructure and letting them in, because technology is the most decisive for geopolitics. It's not geography anymore, it's technology, so we need to rethink that. And that's what de-risking is. So I would say a de-risking agenda on those companies so we can remain free and have open trade, liberal. I'm a liberal, you know. I like it. So I like to be open, and I like to be Europe to be a global competitor and on our own strength, but not with companies who will cheat and will not obey with the level playing field we want to have.
Eva?
Well, my take is that, I mean, if you want me to comment on China, I don't know where the question was going necessarily, but...
Well, last week, the Clement Grosselj, I'm going to...
Yeah, my colleague. He
Yes,
looks like me. He has just about as much hair as I do.
He actually gave a presentation at the subcommittee on security that the EU faces multiple risks from working with Chinese suppliers, for example, undersea cables provided by companies like HMN Technologies. So I guess a question would be, if Europe detaches from these companies that provide these essential infrastructure, will it actually reach the targets of the 2030 digital decade?
Yeah, let me go back a little bit. So first of all, I think it's again commendable that the Commission President took the decision to make that announcement on de-risking. I think it's a good first step of us revisiting not just the digital decade plans, even though to a certain extent we try to adapt it, you know, with things like the CHIPS Act, for example, as I mentioned, or the critical raw materials that are being, that is currently being negotiated. But we also need to revisit our China policy to a certain extent. And I know this will be a very burdensome and difficult exercise, but I think at least in the areas of green and tech, we own that to ourselves. And in this regard, one call I didn't make is again towards more international cooperation with countries that we traditionally cooperate well, but enhance that cooperation. So if we want to be more resilient and better prepared, we won't be able to do that by ourselves. One thing is supply chains, second thing is ecosystem, third thing is making sure that regulation, you know, is there only when it's needed. But the fourth component, particularly talking about tech, is international cooperation. With the US, we do have the TTC. How do we make sure it has more meaning? How do we make sure it has more concrete projects? How do we invite others to join that platform? Be it the UK, Canada, some countries from the Asia Pacific. I think we need to strengthen our international cooperation. Otherwise, there's, you know, even though we have the CHIPS Act, we still do know our dependencies or any of the other files that could qualify as more strategic. So my call would be for more international cooperation and revisiting, of course, some of those strategies.
Well, thank you very much both for this discussion. We now have a little coffee break for those in the room. Please be back at 3 promptly for a conversation on artificial intelligence with my colleague Jan Volpicelli. Okay. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.